Blood seeped onto the oak floor, its warmth pressing against my cheek, the metallic taste flooding my mouth. My shoulder sagged, useless, each breath sharp enough to slice. In the doorway, my sister Claire stood, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, while Mason's heavy footsteps faded down the corridor. She didn't rush to my side. She didn't call for help. She just spoke, her voice so steady it felt scripted. "You should have signed the documents, Emily." Then she was gone. "I'm Captain Emily Carter, U.S. Army Medical Corps, 34 years old. I've stitched up soldiers in field hospitals under mortar fire. I've steadied my hands over shredded arteries as choppers roared above. I've watched men bleed out in desert sand and kept my voice calm. But nothing in my training prepared me for my sister standing by as I was battered in my own home, her words cutting deeper than Mason's fists ever could. That night had been still, eerily so, until the pounding began. Not a polite tap of a family visit, but the relentless hammering of someone convinced they could break their way in. When the doorframe cracked, Mason's face was the first thing I saw, flushed with fury, sweat staining his shirt collar. Behind him, Claire lingered, her eyes not on me but scanning the apartment, as if she was already detaching herself from the scene. I knew why they were there. A week earlier, they'd shown up with a slick pamphlet for a 100-acre horse ranch outside Austin. "It's our future," Claire had said, her voice like a child dreaming of joining the circus. All they needed, they insisted, was my signature as a loan guarantor. It was a $1.2 million mortgage, more than double my yearly pay. And I'd said no, not with anger or disdain, just no. I knew what would happen if their grand plan failed. I couldn't risk my home, my career, my security clearance for their gamble. Mason saw it differently. To him, I was betraying family loyalty, some unspoken rule that demanded I sacrifice everything for them. His hands were on me before I could react, slamming me against the wall hard enough to shake the framed flag above my desk. My training urged me to stay calm, assess injuries, find an escape. My instincts screamed to fight. But when I looked to Claire, searching for the sister I'd shared childhood clothes and secrets with, I saw only a stranger. Her words still echo in my mind. "You should have signed the documents," as if a signature could have undone that moment. As if my refusal justified the bruises spreading across my skin. I'd seen betrayal in war zones, silent, efficient, final. I never imagined it in my own living room, delivered by the one person I thought would always have my back. I wish I could say that night was a shock, a sudden storm I never saw coming. But the truth is, I'd sensed the tension building for years, subtle at first, like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. Claire and I grew up in a home where uniforms were second nature, the scent of boot polish lingering in the halls. Our father was Army, our mother a nurse who followed him from post to post. We learned early that discipline and loyalty weren't optional, they were commands. I wore those values like a shield. Claire treated them like a jacket she could slip off when it felt restrictive. By the time I deployed for the first time, Claire had left college, calling it a temporary break until she found her path. What followed were fleeting jobs, bartending, car sales, a boutique that shuttered in months. I sent letters from the Middle East. She sent photos from music festivals. We were different, but we were sisters, or so I thought. Then Mason entered the picture. A former Marine, discharged after a knee injury, he was all charm and easy grins when we met at a barbecue. But beneath the surface, I noticed something else. The way his grip tightened on Claire's arm when she laughed, the subtle corrections to her words, like he was rewriting her in real time. I'd served with enough soldiers to spot control when it appeared. It rarely starts loud. It starts with molding. A year later, I stood as Claire's maid of honor at a wedding that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Live music, crystal centerpieces, champagne that didn't come cheap. I smiled for the camera, but I couldn't stop thinking about the cost. Mason's landscaping business was barely afloat. Claire wasn't working. They didn't have the savings for this. Soon the calls began, small amounts at first, then larger. "Just until the next job comes through," Mason would say. I told myself this was what family did. But each time I agreed, I felt my armor, forged at Fort Bragg, start to fracture. I didn't realize those cracks were how the storm would slip in. It was a Tuesday when they arrived, Claire in a silk dress I didn't recognize, Mason in a suit that didn't match his usual work boots. They brought a bottle of wine so pricey it could have had its own bodyguard, the kind you open to make a statement. They acted like it was a casual visit, but Mason's eyes roamed my apartment, lingering on the medals in the shadow box above my desk. Claire's smile was too sharp, her laugh a beat too fast. Then Mason pulled a glossy pamphlet from his briefcase and slid it across my coffee table. 100 acres in Texas, open fields, a white-fenced arena, a barn straight out of a film. This, Claire said, tapping the page with a polished nail, is our dream. Mason leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. All we need is your signature on the loan. With your record, the bank will greenlight it immediately. This is life-changing, Emily. I didn't need to read the fine print to smell trouble. A $1.2 million loan, no stable income between them, and optimism that burned through cash like wildfire through brush. I said I'd consider it, buying myself a day before Mason started texting reminders. The next morning, I visited Lieutenant Colonel Miller's office on base. My mentor since my first tour, he could read a financial plan as well as a tactical map. He scanned the pamphlet, his jaw tightening. "No way," he said. "Sign this, and you're tying your career and clearance to their inevitable collapse. Don't let family drag you into a mess you can't escape." When I told Claire and Mason my decision that weekend, the air in my living room shifted. Claire's smile wavered. Mason's didn't. It sharpened like he'd added me to an invisible ledger. He said nothing direct, just set his glass down with a deliberate clink. But his look, steady, calculating, felt like a vow. Not one you honor, but one you pay for. Mason didn't let my refusal stand. Texts started that night, long, angry rants about loyalty and what family owes each other. He'd mentioned favors I never asked for, debts that existed only in his narrative. Then came the calls, silent at first, then heavy breathing, then his voice, low and measured. "You're making a choice you can't unmake, Captain." Claire's approach was quieter, but just as sharp. She sent old photos, 2 girls at Fort Bragg in mismatched camo, grinning like nothing could touch us. Attached would be a line. "Guess we're not a team anymore." Another time, a picture from my commissioning ceremony, her arm through mine with, "I stood by you, you can't do this for me." I'd stare at my phone, fingers hovering, but I never typed the words I wanted, about choice, limits, and the line between love and manipulation. A week later, Mason escalated. I was at the base medical facility finishing a chart when I heard shouting in the hall. 2 MPs had him pinned near the front desk, clutching that same pamphlet, waving it like evidence of my disloyalty. "She's family," his voice boomed. "She can't hide behind a uniform." I stayed put, called the duty officer, and let protocol take over. But the looks from my colleagues lingered for days. Then came the truck. A black pickup like Mason's started parking a block from my apartment. Sometimes it idled with its lights off. Other times it sat cold like a warning planted on my street. Coming home from late shifts, I'd feel that familiar prickle between my shoulders, the one I'd learned to trust in combat zones. I started a log, screenshots, call records, photos of the truck with timestamps. I handed copies to Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, our base security NCO. He nodded unfazed. "We'll keep watch," he said. "And Captain, don't be alone if you don't need to." It was solid advice. But even with the army at my back, I could feel the pressure closing in. Mason wasn't going to fade away. He was waiting for the moment he thought I'd crack. It was just after 9 when my phone glowed with Claire's name. I almost ignored it, but instinct made me answer. Her voice was off, too composed, like she'd rehearsed it. "Mason's upset. He wants to talk." No explanation, no apology, just a fact like she was reading the forecast. Before I could reply, she hung up. 15 minutes later, the pounding started, not a knock, but a full-on assault that made the doorframe groan. Mason's voice cut through the wood, thick with rage. "Open the door, Emily." I backed toward the kitchen, phone in hand, thumb over the M-piece number. But I hesitated, thinking if I called now, there'd be no turning back with Claire. That split-second pause cost me everything. The frame split under his shoulder, the door swinging open. He was on me before I could move, reeking of whiskey. The first hit was a shove that snapped my head back. Then a fist to my cheek, another to my shoulder, driving me into the wall so hard a picture frame crashed to the floor. Pain flared, blinding. And there was Claire in the doorway, arms crossed. Standing like this was just a minor disruption. Her voice was flat, almost tired. "You should have signed the documents." I wanted to ask how we'd gone from braiding each other's hair in Dad's Jeep to her watching me bleed in my own home. But Mason wasn't done. He swept his arm across the coffee table, sending my laptop to the floor, then leaned in close, his bloodshot eyes inches from mine. "Next time," he growled, "you'll think harder." Then he was gone, Claire with him. The jagged doorframe hung open, the air thick with sweat and splintered wood. I pressed a hand to my cheek, feeling the swelling begin. It took nearly 10 minutes to reach the base gate, each step jarring my shoulder. The M-piece didn't need to ask questions. I was in uniform, bleeding, and I had a name. For the first time in this mess, it wasn't mine they'd be writing down. The M-Piece took me to the base hospital. Fluorescent lights, sterile air, the cold touch of a nurse's hands on my face. X-rays showed a fractured cheekbone and heavy bruising on my shoulder. I'd seen worse in war zones, but those injuries never came from my own family. By morning, CID took over. Special Agent Harris introduced himself, his voice clipped and efficient, flipping open a notepad. His questions were sharp, and I answered with the same precision I used in field reports. But his listening, attentive to every pause, told me he'd done this before. 2 days later, Claire called. No apology, no mention of the bruises she'd witnessed. Just, "Emily, drop the charges. You're making this harder for the family. People are talking. Dad doesn't need the embarrassment." I kept my tone even but firm. "I'm not the one who brought shame to this family." With my JAG attorney, Captain Reeves, we built the case methodically, hallway footage of Mason forcing my door, the threatening texts, and an old police report from Oklahoma, uncovered by Harris, showing Mason accused of assaulting a former girlfriend. Those charges had been dropped. These wouldn't be. The trial split into 2 paths, federal court for the assault and a military review for conduct on a federal installation. Mason arrived in a crisp suit, hair trimmed, his medals pinned to his lapel. He played the role well, quiet, remorseful, the veteran who lost control. I prepared for Claire to back him, to keep his hands clean for the jury. But on day 3, something changed. She took the stand, her voice shaky at first, then steady. She described the pounding on my door the moment it gave way, the first strike Mason landed. Her words sucked the air from the room. When she finished, the jury's eyes shifted, not seeing a sister stirring drama, but a survivor of exactly what I'd described. And Mason, for the first time, stopped smiling. His sentence came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, 6 years in federal prison, followed by a lifetime restraining order. The judge's voice was firm, final, like a hammer on steel. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The burden I'd carried for months hadn't lifted, but it had eased enough for me to stand taller. The physical recovery was tracked in X-rays and mobility tests. The rest, the sleepless nights, the flinch at sudden sounds, took longer. The Army assigned me a counselor trained in combat trauma, but it was the Warrior Sisters group that grounded me. Women in uniform, each with her own story of betrayal behind closed doors. We didn't need to explain the overlap of service and survival, we already understood. Claire's divorce filing came quietly, without fanfare. She left a voicemail one morning. "I'm out." Weeks later, she asked to meet for coffee. The conversation was stilted, full of unspoken traps, but it was a beginning. She was in therapy, unraveling the years Mason had woven into her. I wasn't ready to fully forgive, but I could see the sister I knew trying to emerge. I requested a transfer from my old quarters to a training role, teaching combat medics to stay focused in chaos. The classroom was cleaner than the field, but I kept the scenarios raw, real. I taught them that boundaries weren't just for patient care. They were survival, whether in a war zone or your own home. Some nights I'd walk the training grounds perimeter after the last cadet left, the Texas wind carrying dust and diesel. I'd think about the invisible lines we draw and how easily they're crossed when we're taught family excuses everything. The Army taught me discipline. Mason taught me the cost of letting others define your loyalty. Somewhere between those lessons, I learned my life, my safety, wasn't negotiable. Not for blood, not for history, not for anyone. The first time I spoke publicly after it all, the room was filled with uniforms, some crisp and decorated, others worn from years of service. It was a conference on domestic violence and financial coercion in the military, my name printed neatly under guest speaker. I told my story without softening it, not for drama, but because the truth didn't need polish. I spoke about how loyalty can be twisted, how family ties can become chains if you're not vigilant. Heads nodded, some eyes dropped. They got it. A month later, a letter arrived from a federal prison, Mason's handwriting sharp and controlled. He wrote of regret, claiming prison had given him clarity. I read it once, twice, then set it aside. His words didn't hurt, they didn't heal. My recovery never hinged on his remorse. Claire attended the next year's conference, sitting in the back, hands clasped, listening. We didn't say much after, just shared a brief, steady hug. Sometimes reconciliation isn't loud, it's just the absence of harm. If there's one lesson I carry, it's that blood doesn't guarantee safety, and history doesn't demand obligation. In the military, we train for every threat outside the wire. No one prepares you for the enemy who knows your childhood nickname, who sat at your family's table, who calls you kin. So I teach it now. Draw your boundaries in ink, not pencil. Find your allies on your base, in your unit, in the law. Don't let love or its memory convince you to risk your safety or future. We train to defend a nation. But sometimes, the hardest fight is defending yourself from those you never thought you'd face. And when you win, not with anger, but with resolve, you carry an honor no one can take. If this story resonates, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where are you reading from? Share your location and reflections. I read every message. Your voice matters. And if you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button and join our community.